Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Apocrypha Apocalypse. I'm Gary Machuda, and we are continuing our series as we're looking at rabbinic literature. Earlier in the series, we looked at the idea of defiling the hands as an indication that a text is sacred. In the last video, we looked at Norm Geisler's quote where he says that the rabbis had always rejected the Deuterocanon, or what he called Apocrypha. And we saw that within rabbinic literature that blanket statement is not exactly accurate. It is true that in rabbinic Judaism, the Deuterocanon was rejected as not defiling the hands. That is, they're not sacred text. But we also saw some indication that this was not completely universal, that there were rabbis who did understand, at least the text of Sirach or Ben Sirach, as having authority, perhaps sacred authority, and even it was found in the third section of the Rabbinic Bible known as the writings or the Ketuvim. So what I want to do in this video, and I think this will also be a short video, is I want to look at that particular text, the claim that it was included in the third division of the Rabbinic Bible. And I want to see if we can glean some other information from outside of rabbinical Judaism to maybe help clarify and see what's going on here. So that's what we're going to do here on the Apocrypha Apocalypse. So fasten your seatbelts, folks, because the Apocrypha Apocalypse is about to begin. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to begin by a quote by Robert Henry Charles in his work, The Apocrypha of the Old Testament, in which he kind of sets up what we've talked about in the previous video. He writes, quote, "When the writings were wholly without pale of the sacred books, such as those of the heretics or the Samaritans, they were usually designated as outside books. To this class, the Apocrypha were never relegated, save Sirach, according to the statement found only in Sanhedrin 10:1, in the Palestinian Talmud, where it is stated that whoso reads the outside books would have no part in the life to come. But it is clear that there is an error either in the text or the interpretation. For Sirach is very frequently cited by rabbis, and two passages of it are cited as belonging to the Hagiographa or the Ketuvim or the writings. The facts show that Sirach was read at all events for private edification, though not in the synagogues. So this is R.H. Charles, Apocrypha of the Old Testament. And it's that last part that we ended our last video. This comes from the Babylonian Talmud. It's worth repeating here again. It records, quote, "Said Rabbah to Rabbah bar Mari, quote, how on the basis of scripture do you know that which people say a bad palm is usually finds its way to a grove of barren trees? He said to him, it is written in the Torah, repeated in the prophets, mentioned a third time in the writings, and it is also learned in the Mishnah paragraph and repeated as Tananite statement as well. It is written in the Torah, so Esau went to Ishmael. It is repeated in the prophets that there gathered themselves to Jephthah idle men, and they went out with him. It is mentioned a third time in the writings. Every fowl dwells near its kind, and man near his equal." And this is a quote from the Deuterocanonical book of Sirach 13:15. And as we noted in the last video, that this places Ben Sirach actually within the corpus of that third division of the Rabbinic Bible, the writings, or the Ketuvim, or the Hagiographa. Now, to this, Roger Beckwith, who makes some very interesting observations in regard not only to this, but also to, as we mentioned in the other video, the many, many times that Ben Sirach is quoted within rabbinic literature with the formal introduction is written. So let's read Roger Beckwith. This comes from his book, Old Testament Canon in the New Testament Church and its Background in Early Judaism, which was published in 1985. This is found in page 378 of that book. Beckwith writes, quote, "The formula it is written in the book of Ben Sirach is parallel to formulas used with named biblical books, and so could imply that the book is scripture. However, it is not as definite in its meaning as the absolute expression it is written, i.e., it is well-known and authoritative scripture. The particular book is not being named. Since an expression of the former kind is also used in quoting the megalith Tananith, and he gives various examples of it, thus it is written in the book of Ben Sirach, like it is written in the megalith Tananith, implies that an authoritative text is being quoted, but not necessarily that an inspired one is. Only a formula that unambiguously favors canonicity is used by the 4th century teacher Rabbi ben Mari, which we just read, written in the Hagiographa, or it's taught in the Hagiographa, or the Ketuvim, or the writings, with which he cites 2 related proverbs from Ecclesiasticus in Baba Batha Kama 32b. Now, I think Roger Beckwith's point here is well taken, that the formula, it is written in these formal quotations from Ben Sirach in rabbinic literature, certainly it shows that it is authoritative, but it doesn't necessarily point to inspiration. And although I think his point is weakened if he assumes that, and he does make this assumption, that at this point in time, the rabbis didn't see the other rabbinic oral tradition as not being sacred. So I think that's what his point rests on. I'm not sure whether that could be fully established. As I mentioned in the other video, I've read a couple of books written by Jewish scholars who have actually argued that the early writings of the rabbis that include these oral traditions actually almost has a kind of quasi-scriptural sacredness to them. So his point is, I think it's well made. I don't think it clinches the case, but nevertheless, all these all these formal quotations from Ben Sirach does point in the direction that possibly could be scripture, but it's not definitive. So let's continue on with Beckwith. He says, however, now this is in regards to a statement about where Rabbi Bar Mari includes Ben Sirach as a quote from that 3rd division of the Rabbinic Bible. He says, however, since there is no other evidence that Ecclesiasticus ever had a place in the Hagiographa, or the writings, and since it's hard to believe that there was any uncertainty about the identity of the canonical books by the 4th century AD, likely explanation is that Rabbi ben Mari supposed himself to be quoting from the book of Proverbs, as both books contain so many proverbial statements. Confusion between them has been apt to occur in all periods of history. Okay, so let's break this down a little bit. Comment. First, he says there's no evidence that Ecclesiasticus, that's Sirach, Ben Sirach, ever had a place in the Ketuvim, the writings, the 3rd division of the Rabbinic Bible. Well, first you have all those formal statements that certainly would point in that direction. And it's kind of interesting how Roger Beckwith seems to have suffered amnesia about all these statements that he just recollected in the preceding section. But nevertheless, since they're not definitive and they do point in that direction, that's interesting. But, there is evidence outside of rabbinic literature, and we'll look at that suggests that, yeah, at least in some quarters of rabbinic Judaism going into the 4th century, that there is evidence that perhaps the Jews still included Ben Sirach in that 3rd division of sacred scripture known as the writings. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. He says that it's hard to believe that there was any uncertainty about the identity of the canonical books by the 4th century AD. Now notice here, this is the fallacy of the appeal to incredulity. He doesn't say that it's impossible. He doesn't give any arguments or evidence why this is so. He just bases his claim on the fact that it's difficult for us to imagine this. Well, he presupposes the thesis in which he's defending. He believes that the Old Testament canon was actually fixed and closed before the Christian era, and that it remained fixed and closed from then out. So 4 centuries, 5 centuries later, yeah, for Roger Beckwith's theory, this evidence would be hard to believe, but nevertheless, it is there. It is a defeater among many other defeaters to his overall thesis. So here he says, well, since it's hard to believe that this could actually be giving it a factual statement of the case that he actually is quoting from where he says he's quoting, then we have to look for some loopholes to reconcile this tension. And he believes that he must have got the Ben Sirach mixed up with Proverbs. But then again, someone could say it's hard to believe that someone who has studied the Tanakh would mix up the canonical inspired work of Proverbs with the Deuterocanonical, or the so-called apocryphal book of Ben Sirach. I mean, I guess it's possible, but it is hard to believe. But I don't want to commit that fallacy. But I just thought, it just shows how that fallacious kind of reasoning can be flipped around and used in different directions. So anyway, that aside, let's look to see whether or not there is other evidence outside of rabbinic literature that perhaps rabbis in certain locations and times may have accepted Ben Sirach as sacred and or included it among the third division of the Rabbinic Bible. Maybe it was included in the third division, but it was understood to be not part of the sacred text. And I think that's a better solution for all these problems that come up in regards to this issue. So if we look at Christian writings, and especially those fathers who are said to have had close connection with rabbinic tradition, we find some very interesting clues to this effect. And I go into this a little bit in detail in my book, The Case for the Deuterocanon, Arguments and Evidence. The earliest evidence we find comes from Origen of Alexandria. Origen knew Hebrew, and he, well, to various extents, scholars kind of debate his knowledge of Hebrew, but nevertheless, he had frequent contact with various Jewish communities, and he writes about those, and he also reports their views in his writing. So he does have contact with Rabbinic Judaism. And we have a fragment from his commentary on the Psalms where he reproduces the names of the rabbinic scriptures, giving both the Hebrew and Greek titles. And what's really interesting here, and here's the quote, notice at the very end, he places aside from these last books of the Rabbinic Bible, he says, besides these are the books of Maccabees, which are entitled Sarbeth Sabneel. What's intriguing here is that, well, first, Origen sees that, yes, Rabbinic Judaism does not include Maccabees among the listed books that he gives. However, he is able to reproduce the Hebrew title for the Maccabees. So who was using a Hebrew title for Maccabees? The rabbis were. This suggests that during the time of Origen, now this is very early, that the books of Maccabees were still being copied and circulated in Hebrew. And that, notice he associates them with, but he doesn't include them with, the 22 books of the Hebrew Bible. Okay, so this is a tantalizing clue, but it certainly is not definitive. Okay, let's move on to Hilary of Poitiers. Now, Hilary is, in his commentary on the Psalms, he's largely dependent on Origen's commentary on the Psalms, the fact that he kind of reproduces much of what Origen wrote. At least scholars believe this to be so. And he has a very interesting comment in regards to the number of books. And here he's referring to the rabbinic computation that was given by Origen. Now, as you may know, within rabbinic tradition, the books of sacred scripture are usually collected in a certain number. So there's usually either counted as 22 books or 24 books. So the Rabbinic Bible could be a 22-book computation or a 24-book computation, depending on how you count each book. Sometimes they combine books together to bring about those particular numbers. And those numbers tend to correspond to alphabets. The Hebrew alphabet, for example, has 22 letters. So here's what Hilary Poitier has to say. He says, quote, "And this is the cause that the law of the Old Testament is divided into 22 books, that they might agree with the number of letters. These books are arranged according to the tradition of the ancients, so that 5 are from Moses," and then it goes on and completes the number 22 books. "To some, it seemed good to add Tobias and Judith and thus constitute 24 books according to the Greek alphabet." Now, I find this intriguing, right? Because, like I said, in rabbinic history, you have either a 22-book or a 24-book computation. And Hilary's saying that the cause of this division, the 22-book division, is because the rabbis wished that the number of books would correspond to the letters of the Hebrew alphabets. Okay. And so there is this 22-book computation. But then he says, in regards to the 24, which is also used in rabbinic tradition, that 2 books are added, Tobias and Judith, and thus constitutes 24 books according to the Greek alphabet. Again, this is tantalizing because it seems that Hilary is saying that within the 24 books of the Tanakh are also included Tobias and Judith, 2 Deuterocanonical books. Now, I suppose somebody could push back on this and say, well, maybe Hilary was mistaken. Maybe he's reading things into this. Maybe he's trying to show off and show the correspondence between the Hebrew and Greek alphabets and these 2 computations, and he just assumes these are the 2 books that are in there. That's fine. But as we continue on, we find other intriguing things as well. Now, remember, as we're approaching the 4th century, where Rabbi Ben Mari says it's part of the Hagiographa, we're finding this stuff in Christian literature, okay? Epiphanius Islam. Now, Epiphanius is usually singled out by Protestants as someone who understood Rabbinic Judaism and it gives a clear understanding of the true canon of Scripture, which includes, or excludes, I should say, the Deuterocanon. So he too has some very interesting things to say in his Panarion on Judaism. Actually, this is the continuation of Judaism. He says the following: "By the time of the captives' return from Babylon, these Jews had acquired the following books and prophets. In the following books of prophets," and he continues, he lists the proto-canonical books plus the Deuterocanonical book of Baruch. And then he continues and says, "And they," that is the Jews, "have 2 more books of disputed canonicity, the wisdom of Sirach and the wisdom of Solomon, apart from other Apocrypha." Again, very intriguing because, first he lists the books that they received when they came back from Babylonian captivity. He gives the proto-canonical books in Baruch. And then he says that they also have 2 other books. Now, it's interesting. I wonder what he means by have. He doesn't really say. But he says these books are of disputed canonicity. Now, why would it be disputed canonicity in the 4th century? Wasn't the Jews lockstep and uniformed in their rejection of these books? Well, Epiphanius seems to suggest that this was something of an open question, even at his own time. And this is before the beginning of the 5th century. He says that they have wisdom and Sirach apart from certain other Apocrypha. Okay, so again, what is this possession of these books? Why do they possess the books, and where do they possess the books? That's the question. Now we come to Jerome. Jerome, in his prefaces to the books of Tobit and Judith, says some interesting things, especially in Judith. He says in his preface to Tobit, I do not cease to wonder at the constancy of your demanding, for you demand that I bring a book written in Chaldean words into Latin writing, indeed the book of Tobias, which the Hebrews exclude from the catalog of divine scripture, being mindful of those things which they have titled hagiographa or writings. I have done enough for your desire, yet not by my study, and so on and so forth. So he kind of implies that Tobias is associated with or part of the hagiographa, the Ketuvim, the writings. But he's even clearer when he writes the book of Judith. In his preface, he says, among the Hebrews, the book of Judith is found among the hagiographa, the authority of which towards confirming those which have come into contention is judged less appropriate. Yet having been written in Chaldean words, it is counted among the histories. So here you have two books that are written in Aramaic. And in this last part, notice that he says that Judith is found amongst the books of the writings. And here he's talking about Rabbinic Judaism includes Judith among the writings. However, the authority of Judith for confirming things is judged less appropriate. So it does even have some weight, but it's just not really appropriate to be citing this book, even though it's in the hagiographa or the writings. So we have these clues starting with Origen, Hilary, Epiphanius, and Jerome. All these fathers, scholars point out, actually do have contact with the Jews. They interacted with rabbinic tradition. And in fact, with Jerome, he accepts a lot of what the rabbis taught. Nevertheless, you have these indications that the Jews continue to retain the Deuterocanon or parts of the Deuterocanon in the original language, Hebrew or Aramaic, which is very interesting because these would be unpointed text. And so you would have to memorize the vowels. In other words, these are books that would be continuously read and understood. And in some cases, we even find, like with Jerome, where he specifically says it's in that third division, just like Rabbi Bamari says that he quotes it from the Hagiographa or the writings or the Ketuvim. So what does that mean? Well, I think this is an indication that within Rabbinic Judaism, that it took a long time to standardize the rabbinic text that was established with Rabbi Ben Kiva, and that there were some pockets of rabbis who continued to use Ben Sira. And from these other, if the Christian writers are to be accepted, apparently some other deuterocanonical books like Tobit, Judith, Maccabees, that there's continue to be used and read, okay, for private use within Rabbinic Judaism. And although they may have even been physically included with the writings, nevertheless, the rabbis did not accord them authority. Okay, so that's the status we find in the 4th Christian century. And as I note in my case for the Deuterocanon, if what I said is true, and I realize that some of this stuff is tangential, and but I think it has a good deal of explanatory power in clearing up some tensions that otherwise we find within the various texts. This opens up a very intriguing question, because were these books added after the fact? Was the canon closed and then some rabbis added extra books and included these in the Tanakh? Or would it be more reasonable to assume that these books were considered earlier on as sacred text, at least by some Jews, and that it found its way into the third division? And eventually, when Judaism rejects their authority, it took a while for them to be physically removed from the Tanakh. I think that's very intriguing because we see the same kind of phenomenon occurring within Protestantism. Because when Luther split from the church, he didn't remove the Deuterocanon. And this is an error that a lot of Catholic apologists make. Luther did not remove these books from the Bible. He couldn't, because everyone was familiar with these books being in their Bible. So instead, what he did was he collected them into a collection called the Apocrypha, and he downgraded them and said, these are good and holy to be read, but they can't be used to confirm doctrine. Well, something similar seems to have happened in Rabbinic Judaism, at least in my humble opinion, that the Jews continue to retain these books, but rather they had this tradition of downgrading them, of not according them the same level of authority. And we're talking in the Christian era, okay? So this is long after the time of Christ, long after the church has spread to the four corners of the world. So you have this retention within Protestantism, and it was only later, much, much later, that this appendix was moved to the back of the Bible, and eventually in the 1820s, it was removed from Protestant Bibles. So we have a few centuries after the initial rejection that there was retention, degradation, and then eventually removal. And if that's true with Protestantism, I think that I could document that that is the case in Protestantism. We seem to have a similar phenomenon going on here in Rabbinic Judaism, because if the Rabbinic Bible was closed in the second Christian century, you only have to move a couple of centuries later, you still seem to find evidence of retention within Judaism, and then eventually they're almost completely removed. So I think some very intriguing stuff, and I think it points to the fact that these books were perhaps originally accepted as sacred by Jews prior to Rabbinic Judaism, and there was a post-Christian change in that collection, and that explains the retention, and it would explain how these books were kept at arm's length until the 4th century. So I agree with Lee McDonald that I think the Rabbinic Bible, the if you want to call it canon, really wasn't closed and fixed and universally accepted until we get in 4 centuries or so into the Christian era. So with that, I'm going to end the video. Thank you so much for watching. Again, if you can, if you like this stuff, subscribe, like, ring the bell, tell your friends, support us on Patreon. We really appreciate it. Bye-bye.